Welcome back to my channel, Famous and Fabulous. Oh my god, that's a really good question, because you would likely only receive a small number of people who would be active. Even at 68, Vince Gill maintains the demeanor of the modest guitar-wielding poet whom audiences adored decades ago. However, the public rarely sees the aspect of guilt that lies behind the velvet voice and shelves of Grammy Awards. The man who has hidden his genuine emotions under decades of rustic charm. The quiet critic, the ferocious rival. Throughout his career, Gill harbored a secret grudge against musicians who disregarded the genre he dedicated his life to promoting, violated the laws of tradition, or pursued celebrity over craft. Vince Gill has finally disclosed the identities of these 7 musicians in a recent interview. Even if you may believe you know Vince Gill, you won't ever hear their or his music again after this. Once more, in the same manner. Let's go back to the first step, before the fame and the feuds, because you'll be doubting everything you believed to be true about country aristocracy by the time we get to the last person on his list, Vince Gill's creation. He was born and raised in Norman, Oklahoma. Nashville isn't quite there, but it's close enough to dream. Vince Gill was raised in a home that valued hard work and music. His dad was a part-time musician and a federal judge, loveful but strict. He taught Gill self-control and how to play the guitar, 2 things that would influence not only his music but also his whole personality. Vince experienced tragedy along the way to success. In his early years, he worked at little gigs, slept in vans, and took whatever little money he could find to join bluegrass bands. He discovered that he could live off of his skill, perseverance, and the encouragement of other musicians who understood his unique ability. However, when he joined Pure Prairie League, a country rock band, everything changed. His voice caught people's attention and didn't end. He became a mainstay of the country scene in the 1980s and 1990s. 21 Grammys, innumerable casts, and admiration from all sectors of the industry. He rose to fame as a songwriter and performer who never followed trends or cut corners. His poems were honest, and his guitar was elegant. However, that success was followed by disappointment, because Vince saw firsthand how his favorite genre started to change behind the scenes. Quicker, more ostentatious, and more commercial. Not always in ways he approved of, country music was evolving. He observed that rather than competence, artists rose on their image. He saw mass-market formulas replace true songwriting. He noticed that awards were going to performers who, in his opinion, hadn't earned their place and who had based their careers more on catchphrases, gimmicks, and shock value than on merit. Even though he was furious, he respectfully applauded during award shows. He witnessed musicians lip-syncing while actual musicians were marginalized. He saw business leaders honor musicians who chose to play politics above instruments. The saddest part was that he witnessed the essence of country music. Flash, manufactured rebellion, and filters take the place of truth, struggle, and humility. After years of holding his tongue, he has finally come out of it. Up until today, Vince has never mentioned names. Kristofferson, Chris. We managed to get through the night really well. Why? The Lord is great. Is this guy a fantastic vocalist in your opinion? Not always. Even devoted fans were taken aback by this one because Vince Gill had openly lauded the greats and legends who had cleared the path for decades. However, insiders claim that Vince avoided one name entirely behind the scenes. Kristofferson, Chris. Their worlds were different. The outlaw poet was Chris. Unpredictable, jagged, and raw. He would slur his way through interviews, crash parties, and still leave with the respect of the group. Conversely, Vince was exact, well-groomed, a studio technician, and a stage perfectionist. Vocal control, lyrical structure, and technical proficiency were all important to him. Even though Vince never publicly disparaged Kristofferson, there was something in the way he avoided mentioning him in interviews. The lengthy silences and the feelings that were not spoken. For years, a single story from a CMA rehearsal circulated. Vince allegedly departed early when Kristofferson was supposed to perform, muttering something about not wanting to see another train catastrophe on stage. That was never verified. Stories like that, however, don't require validation to remain popular in Nashville. It was said in private that Vince was quite irritated by the way commentators romanticized Kristofferson's messiness by describing it as genuine, gritty, and true. Other, more accomplished performers who put in endless practice, however, were overlooked. "It's not deep, it's just sloppy," according to a close friend. We labeled it brilliance and lowered the bar. Kristofferson's success was not something he detested. He objected to the fact that it changed the standards for what was considered outstanding. For Vince, being an artist meant becoming an expert at what you do. He believed that Chris had gotten away with the damage and was rewarded for it. The tension persisted for years after that. No collaborations, tributes, or duets were present. His name was noticeably missing, like a ghost left off the guest list, even when Vince hosted parties commemorating other greats from Kristofferson's time. And now, in a rare instance of candor, Gill added him to the list, not intentionally, but because the gap was too great to ignore. However, if Vince viewed Kristoffer as a representation of anarchy, the next performer, in his opinion, stood for something even worse. The point at which country music lost its essence. Brooks, Gar. To imply conflict between Garth Brooks and Vince Gill is practically sacrilegious. Two titans of the field. There are two names that are deeply ingrained in country music. However, the split becomes unavoidable if you are aware of the past and have heeded the subliminal cues. The quiet poet and artisan Vince would spend hours honing a solo and revising a verse until it seemed right. He introduced the genre to pyrotechnics, headset microphones, and an enormous ego. Some people, like Vince, felt that something precious was being trampled underfoot when he transformed country performances into rock extravaganzas. It was the philosophy, not simply the acts. Gill appreciated melody, subtlety, and restraint. G appreciated scale, sparkle, and movement. G shouted about heartbreak throughout sold-out arenas, while Vince whispered it. Gill considered himself to be a guardian of the nation's heritage. For better or worse, he believed that G was the mastermind behind its commercial revolution. Gill once bemoaned in interviews that country music had lost its stories. Although he never explicitly blamed anyone, fans made the connection. G's name didn't need to be said. Everyone was aware of who changed the regulations and changed the river's course. Additionally, many believed that country music was losing its soul when G started to sell out arenas and take center stage at award events. Additionally, Vince was being subtly pushed aside despite his melancholy songs and guitar solos. According to insiders, Vince was polite in public, but privately lamented the state of the genre. According to reports, he declined chances to give G Lifetime Achievement Awards, not because he was resentful, but rather because he was unable to pretend to feel admiration for G. It was more than just a collision of styles. It had to do with philosophy. For Vince, country music had nothing to do with crowd surfing or fireworks. It was about humility, origins, and storytelling, and despite his success, Goo reflected a time when those ideals were obscured by the cacophony of the masses. Was it heartbreak or jealousy to see a genre change so drastically? Perhaps both. Gill never rejoiced over Gar's victories, in any case. The standing ovations were met with no applause from him. He never arrived at the seats in the front rows, a mullet-wearing hottie who caused country music to take off for all the wrong reasons. Is next, Cyrus Billy Ray. Billy Ray Cyrus became a household name quickly thanks to his achingly tender heart. It was memorable. Before there was such a thing as viral, it was viral. Additionally, it immediately ushered country music into the history of pop culture. Not everyone, though, was applauding. According to reports, Vince Gill, whose musical background was based on sophisticated songwriting, jazz-level complexity, and traditional country traditions, thought the song was disrespectful to true talent. Gill was heard making a joke about Billy Ray's song-setting country music back 10 years in a CMA green room. Furthermore, that wasn't a one-time comment. Among industry insiders, that comment spread like wildfire. stoking rumors that Gill believed Billy Ray posed a threat to the integrity of the genre. According to Vince, country music should be about truth, hope, suffering, and tales. Billy Ray, however, arrived with a one-liner hook, a dance fad, and a marketing machine so massive that it overpowered everything else. According to reports, Gill once claimed that the song resembled karaoke with a mullet rather than country. The two never worked together, never shared a stage, and their interactions in the hallway were described as at best chilly. Billy Ray appeared to go in the opposite direction from other musicians who attempted to strike a balance between invention and adherence to tradition. He leaned into the gimmick, the hair, the flash, and the hips. All of it seemed to Vince like a caricature of what country was meant to be, sincere, rooted, and the result of personal experience. Gill didn't personally despise Billy Ray. He didn't have to. However, Billy Ray's representation was intolerable to him. Nashville started to move in a direction Gill had resisted all of his life due to an increase in gimmicky, fantasy over substance music, and the upcoming performer. Gill couldn't stand the sound of her records, and she sold more albums than almost anyone else in the history of the genre. Twain, Shania Twain, was considered the world's country pop queen. Her ascent was swift, revolutionary, glitzy, and unstoppable. However, she was seen by many purists, especially Vince Gill, as a disruptor. Gill promoted raw, roots-driven music, but her pop-heavy hooks, beautiful production, and enormous crossover appeal left little room for it. Following in her footsteps, a slew of musicians adopted the same streamlined style, abandoning tradition in favor of hit songs and music videos worth millions of dollars. Gill once remarked, "We lost a generation of real country fans chasing radio hits." But he never specifically mentioned her. "Sometimes we forget what genre we're in," he continued. Reading between the lines wasn't difficult for devoted fans. Gill and Twain never met, although the majority of industry superstars did ultimately meet paths, perform duets, tributes, or at least share a stage. Not at award presentations, not during her ascent, and not even during genre-spanning tributes, where their names would have fit together perfectly. It wasn't simply unpleasant for the two enormous artists in the same lane. It was quite loud. According to several insiders, Vince considered Shania's ascent to prominence to be a turning point. He epitomized bro country and left Vince scratching his head when Nashville began focusing on following trends rather than skill, and when country music began to sound anything but. Aldean Aldean made his debut with baseball caps, loud guitars, and lyrics that were less about heartache and truth and more about trucks, whiskey, and tailgating. His fan base grew rapidly, his brand was audacious, and his sound was loud. Although he was well received by the general public, not all Nashville residents were impressed. Conversely, Vince Gill has consistently defended narrative as soul and songwriting as an art form. He also openly expressed his dislike of the bro country movement. "I believe we've simplified it," he previously told Rolling Stone. "Music has its place, but let's not act like it's country just because the video features a pickup truck." That wasn't just a whimsy. A shot across the bow was what it was. Gill saw Aldean's ascent as yet another break from the principles he had battled to uphold. Gill never thought country music stood for loud production, shallow lyrics, and what he called lifestyle marketing. Above lived experience. Gill and Aldean have never shared a bill, despite the fact that they have both performed at significant country festivals. Additionally, according to insiders, Gill has discreetly refused to appear at or go to any event where Aldean was the main attraction. Ego was not the issue. Identity was at issue. Gill found it impossible to support what Aldean stood for. It was more than just a stylistic distance. It had a philosophical bent. While one based his legacy on spectacle, the other on substance. However, the next individual might have been too loud for the entire globe if Aldean was too loud for Gill. Kanye West. Though it may seem unrealistic, listen to us. Despite never naming Kanye West, Vince Gill has made one thing very apparent in a number of interviews. He thinks that contemporary music's ego is suffocating. He has criticized musicians that prioritize spectacle over depth and popularity over skill. Additionally, If that seems familiar, it is. I see young artists walk into a room and expect the world to bow, Gill stated in an interview in 2016. Listening first was how you gained respect in my day. Gill simply grinned and remained silent when asked if he was referring to a specific person. However, that quote's timing wasn't random. It happened in the same month that, in a now famous tirade, Kanye proclaimed himself the greatest artist of all time. There was a lot of speculation in the media. Supporters interpret the text. They claimed that the industry was well aware of Vince's intended target. Gill considers music to be sacred. It all comes down to sincerity, service, and humility. It's not about taking over award shows or always vying for attention. And whether on purpose or not, Kanye came to represent everything that Vince appeared to oppose. Self-worship over soul, chaos over control. They didn't need to and never did cross paths. For Vince, this had nothing to do with genre. It has to do with morals. You are now aware of the 7 names Vince Gill was unable to tolerate, both in public and in private. These weren't just any arguments between titans, pop stars, and genre-bending risk-takers. The essence of country music was profoundly shattered by them. There were times when Vince opted for dignity over popularity and silence over support.